high-profile terrorism investigations, including the bombing investigation of the A.P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. In this episode, Ken Williams reviews the events that led him to write what is now known as the Phoenix Memo. He also reviews his untimely reassignment to work on the Phoenix Mountain Arsonist case and the aftermath of 9/11. Ken authored the Phoenix Memo prior to the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. The communication issued a warning to the intelligence community that Al-Qaeda members were training in the civil aviation community in the United States. Following the terrorist attacks, his memo became public and received attention from national news media. Ken testified before the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate regarding terrorism matters and cooperated with the 9/11 Commission. Ken has extensive experience investigating sensitive international terrorism matters and has traveled for the Bureau to the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. During his FBI career, Ken has received prestigious commendations such as the CIA's Exceptional Human Intelligence Collector Award. Ken has appeared on local television news and has made many public appearances regarding terrorism matters. Currently, he works for Tolhurst International, LLC, a licensed private investigations firm that also provides security consultants, customizable training courses, and guest speaker services. Before we get to the interview, I have a few important things that I want to tell you about. First of all, just want to make sure that you heard my announcement that FBI Retired Case File Review will be on Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2020 in Orlando, Florida, from May 1st through the 3rd. CrimeCon is the biggest true crime convention in the world. If you're going, I can't wait to meet you in person. If you use promo code FBI 2020, you'll get 10% off your registration, and you can find the link to register on the homepage of my website, jerrywilliams.com. Also on the homepage, you will find some information about my webinar. I will be doing a webinar on FBI myths and misconceptions Tuesday, January 28th at 8 p.m. for the National Sisters in Crime, an organization for women crime fiction authors and crime fiction lovers. I believe everyone, though, is invited. You don't have to be a member. There is more information about how to register at jerrywilliams.com. The audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardback for FBI Myths and Misconceptions are available wherever books are sold. You can find an easy link to some of the retailers in your podcast app's description of this episode. I also want to invite you to join my reader team. Once a month, I send out my email digest and try to keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. You can join on my website or use the link in the description of this episode in your podcast app. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Ken Williams. Hi, Ken.
How you doing, Jerry?
Well, I am so excited. First of all, I have to say thank you to your buddy, Keith Tolhurst, who suggested that I have you on the show. I think this is an important case and topic to discuss and to share. And so I really want to thank him for introducing us. And I want to thank you for saying yes.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. I think what you're doing is very important. And when Keith told me about your show and the concept of it, and then after talking to you personally, it even solidified it even more. I think it's very important to get this type of stuff memorialized by agents across the country that have worked some pretty interesting cases, not only for the benefit of your audience that are non-FBI agents, but hopefully FBI agent students, those that are in the academy right now, and then maybe those that are just right out of the academy, can listen to veteran agents' successes and mistakes, and so they don't fall into the same pitfalls as we did, or they can have the same successes as we did. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, excellent. Well, I have spent several days, reading articles and watching YouTube videos featuring you. And I even had a chance to read the redacted and unclassified Office of Inspector General's report from November of 2004, which was on the FBI's handling of the Phoenix Memo. So I have a good background, but I'm only going to ask questions and jump in when I really need to. This is your opportunity to share your story. So where do you want to start?
Well, I think what I want to do is, I think this is an important subject matter that we're taking on here, because what it involves two separate cases that really clashed together and had tragic consequences, I believe. It was a case that I started looking at some Islamic extremists, and then it was interrupted by a domestic arson investigation. And I think it's an important learning lesson, not only for agents, but for supervisors in the field, to take away that when an agent tells you, hey, listen, I think this other case that I'm looking at is more important than the one you want to put me on, take that agent for his or her word and let them continue on it. I'm not pointing the fingers at anybody at all. I mean, hindsight's always 20/20, but I mean, it is definitely a case where you shouldn't mix apples and oranges, and because it could result in some tragic consequences, in my opinion.
Well, one thing I do want to say before you really get into the case is that when most people think about terrorism, especially international terrorism, they certainly don't think about Phoenix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's ironic because we did a case. It was called the history of Al-Qaeda in the United States, and when you look back in time, going back to shortly after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, we saw a lot of activity pop up here in the state of Arizona, particularly down in the Tucson area, around the Islamic Center, Tucson, the University of Arizona. And individuals that went on to become ranking members of what we now know as Al-Qaeda attended the University of Arizona. And very few people realize that. It's not really documented in a public forum anywhere, really. And I mean, I can go on with names and list the type of names there. Most people won't even recognize those names, except those that are in the intelligence business and know Al-Qaeda. But I'll give you one name, for instance, a guy by the name of Wadea al-Hajj. He's a former Roman Catholic who converted to Sunni Islam, and he was a Tucson resident, and he's spending multiple life sentences or a life sentence in the Supermax in Colorado for his role in the bombings of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. He was a senior bin Laden lieutenant at the time, and he was a state of Arizona resident. So that's just to mention one, and I can go on with name after name after name for your listeners, but most of them wouldn't recognize those names. So, you wouldn't think of it in Arizona, but when we go back in time and we were looking at things, it basically boiled now to nothing more than students that had been here in the past, like the state of Arizona. Some of the subject matters that the universities in the state of Arizona offer are very critical and essential to people living in the Middle Eastern area. They study, there's a lot of geology type courses offered here, water courses offered here, very important stuff for people that come from the desert regions. And so that's where it started. And then as they got here, people continued to come. And at the time when they were coming here, specifically at the University of Arizona, our presence was our presence, the FBI's presence was pretty low in that area. So they were able to get away with and a lot of things that were underneath our radar screen. We didn't see them because we really weren't paying attention to that type of stuff. If you remember in the years before 9/11, one of our critical roles back in the early 80s, throughout the 90s, and up to basically till 9/11 was, especially in border states like Arizona, drug interdiction, drug enforcement was very big for us. Public corruption with crooked border guards, customs officials, and just the cocaine traffic flow across the Arizona-Mexico border was tremendous. And a lot of our resources were dedicated in that area to looking at that. So these guys, when I say these guys, these people that went on to become Al-Qaeda types, were not even really getting looked at all.
Now, that's really interesting. And I think it's important for those non-FBI listeners to understand that in every one of our 56 offices, there are agents assigned to investigate all of the FBI's programs and violations. Even if that office doesn't have a lot, there's still somebody that is responsible if a case comes up to look at that type of a case. So even though the office was, Phoenix was concentrating on drugs, there were still people assigned to, like you, assigned
Yes.
to working terrorism cases.
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point, Jerry. And let me highlight for your audience this: the people that during that time period that I'm talking about late 80s, early 90s, there was basically two people that were responsible for covering this subject in the entire state of Arizona, an individual in Tucson and an individual in Phoenix. I was the individual in Phoenix, and we had another agent, Paul Zapaniak, who's retired now, was responsible for the southern portion of Arizona. So contrast that to where we are now, where the primary focus of the FBI is looking for the likes of which carried out the horrible attacks on September 11th. And then, I mean, two people. I mean, when I look back and I see what has occurred here in Arizona and the agents that are working international terrorism now compared to those days, it's remarkable.
Times have definitely changed.
Yes. But what I'd like to talk to your audience about today is I'm the author of what went on to become known as the Phoenix Memo, and that got a lot of attention in the years after the September 11, 2001 attacks. And I'd like to also talk about a case called the Phoenix Mountain Preserve arson case, and how the two collided, and how I was in the middle of it, and what happened to the investigations. So with your permission, I'd like to get into the how the Phoenix Memo became.
Yes, please do.
Okay. Well, I started this case, in my opinion, in my 30 years with the FBI, most of my best cases, or the cases that I had the most fun working, or challenging cases working, began with information provided to me by a confidential human source, an informant. And this informant was a former member of a terrorist organization called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, under the leadership of Ahmed Jibril at the time. It was headquartered in Damascus, Syria. And this informant of mine was a defector from that organization. Over the course of my career, I ran him for approximately 24 years. But he came to me in 1999, and he told me, he said, he says, there's these two individuals that are going to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona. And for your audience who isn't familiar with Embry-Riddle University, I liken it to like the Ivy League of civil aviation in the United States. It's a very prestigious university. The main campus of that university is located in Daytona Beach, Florida, with the only other satellite campus in the United States being in Prescott. The majority of students that attend Embry-Riddle University attend the Daytona campus, to include a lot of foreign students, people that are in the United States on an F1 student visa. But in this case, and there's thousands of kids that go to school in Daytona, Florida. And the one in Prescott, Arizona, has approximately 3,000, or at the time that I'm talking about, 1999, had approximately 2,600 students, with a small minority of F1 student visas, foreign students that were attending the school. So my informant, who was the former terrorist himself, said, hey, look, there's two guys that are attending this school up in Prescott that you should be interested in. They are forming an organization called the Al-Muhajirun, which in English translates to mean the immigrant, that are attending Embry-Riddle. And he says this organization, the Al-Muhajirun, is a radical organization that was originally founded in Saudi Arabia. He says these guys declare themselves to be the ears, the eyes, the mouthpiece of Osama bin Laden of Al-Qaeda. So he identified these two guys. The first guy identified was a Lebanese national by the name of Zacharias Subra. Subra was attending in the United States, like I said, on an F1 student visa, and he was studying aviation security at the university. Now, I can assure you, a degree from Embry-Riddle University in aviation security would most likely land him a very good job at any international airport in the world. It'd be like getting a degree from like a Harvard or Princeton or an Ivy League school in any other discipline. A degree from Embry-Riddle University is held in high esteem by people in the aviation world. And Subra was the one that was actually standing up this organization that we had never seen in Arizona before, called the Al-Muhajirun. Well, Subra's buddy at that time was a Saudi national, Saudi Arabian national by the name of Ghassan Al-Sharbi. And I want your audience to remember this name because this will prove this will be significant later on towards the end of my presentation.
Repeat that. Yeah, repeat his name again.
His name is Ghassan Al-Sharbi, Sharbi. And like I said to your audience, I want them to remember this name because it's significant towards the end of my presentation. He was a roommate of Zacharias Subra, and he was also in the United States on an F1 student visa. And he was studying electrical engineering at the time as it related to aviation and whatnot at Embry-Riddle University. So here and he was also an adherent to this organization called the Al-Muhajirun, which is at the time a very radical organization that openly, and again, this is all pre 9/11, so they weren't hiding behind, vocalizing their support for Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. So these two guys were living together in Prescott in a Motor Lodge motel. They were printing and distributing propaganda material at Phoenix area mosques. So Prescott is, if for those in your audience who aren't familiar with Arizona, Prescott is approximately 150 miles due north of Phoenix, Arizona. And you have to get on an interstate highway from Prescott to travel to Phoenix. And it's approximately an hour and 50-minute drive from Prescott to Phoenix. These two guys that I named earlier would sometimes a couple times a week drive from Prescott to the Phoenix metropolitan area, Phoenix and Tempe, Arizona, where there's another large mosque. And they would hand out their Al-Muhajirun propaganda. And they were trying to recruit anybody, actually. It didn't have to be youth, but they were targeting the youth to join their organization up in Prescott, Arizona. We found that, I found that, and my informant that first reported it to me, he didn't live in Prescott. He lived in Phoenix, and he would attend the mosque in Phoenix, Arizona, and he would see them hand out this material and spit out their vitriol against the United States, against Israel, and encouraging members of our Muslim community to join their organization. So we found that to be quite interesting. A little bit of history on the Al-Muhajirun. It was founded in 1983 by an individual by the name of Omar Bakri Muhammad, who was a Saudi Arabian. This organization was so radical, even to the Saudi government, that they kicked them out of Saudi Arabia. They were outlawed by Saudi Arabia in 1986, and they relocated from Saudi Arabia to England. Where they set up shop in England and started propagating their support for bin Laden and started spewing their vitriol against Israel in the West there. They would actually issue they issued one fatwa that I found very interesting after I started looking into them from overseas, where they said they were calling for their followers to, attack the U.S., attack the West, to hit their airports, hit their financial institutions, and hit their military. So they were openly calling for their followers to do that type of stuff. And I found it very eerie after the attacks of 9/11 when I saw, issued years ahead of time, that this particular guy in England was calling for his followers to hit airports, airplanes, stuff like that. So, and again, he openly called themselves, quote unquote, the eyes, ears, and mouthpiece of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And again, a lot, most people now in the post 9/11 world have an understanding of the militant ideology of Al-Qaeda. But what I want the audience to take away from the Al-Muhajirun story is this. I mean, even the Saudi Arabian government, who it's been demonstrated for years has supported a lot of these type of organizations, with finances or with, just ideological support, thought that this particular organization was bad enough that they outlawed them in 1986 and forced them to move to England. After the attacks on 9/11, and this is where when the British outlawed their organization in the UK, the United Kingdom, they held a conference in 2002 in England. They were getting ready to hold a conference called the Magnificent 19. And what it was a tribute to the 9/11 hijackers who killed themselves in the mass murder of Americans on September 11, 2001. This is the type of mindset it is. I want your audience to really get that into their, grasp that and hold on to it. These people were so bold that they were having a celebration of life, if you will, for the 19 people who committed that horrible attack on September 11th upon our country. So that's the type of mindset these people were. So, and the Brits outlawed them there. But like I said, the two individuals in Prescott were living in this place called the Delview Motor Inn in Prescott, Arizona. And for your audience who isn't familiar with Arizona, the area of Prescott where this motor lodge was located in it's very very rustic. It's like truly the Wild West. You're out in the middle of nowhere. You're north of the city of Prescott on Old Highway 89, north of the old Veterans Administration Hospital up there. And the motor lodge was historically used or traditionally used as a lodging for antelope hunters. I mean, it's like, these are located on the plains of northern Arizona. And it's like truly, I call it Cowboyville. I mean, so when I first saw these guys, and I identified these guys, Subra and Al-Sharbi, living in this place, I thought to myself, that would have been the last place I would have suspected finding them. And, in the post-9/11 world, when I was still with the Bureau, I would give conferences and lectures to local law enforcement, our partners, our sisters and brothers in law enforcement, local and state law enforcement. I would say, look, it doesn't matter where you're assigned. I mean, anywhere in the country, you don't have to be, this stuff doesn't show up in New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, LA, Chicago. It can show up right here in Arizona, and it can show up in a cowboy type environment, and I don't know if this was done by design by the enemy, where they didn't think we had much of a presence and we wouldn't be looking for them there. But I tell the local sheriffs that are out in rustic America, anywhere around the country, that's very important to pay attention to your environments when you go to a radio call. You may be going to a domestic violence call, maybe you're going to a medical emergency call. To pay attention to what's around you inside that residence. Something, as a former street cop myself, I was never trained to be looking, at pictures on somebody's house when I was in their house. I'd be looking for weapons and things that could hurt me. But in this instance, and you will see that just by having some knowledge of what was hanging on these people's walls, I could tell, when I got in there that these guys were true believers of a real hardcore Islamic extremist cause. So they were living in this place, and they were manufacturing and printing up propaganda that they were handing out to not only students at Embry-Riddle University, but to Muslims located at the Islamic Community Center in Phoenix and the Islamic Center in Tempe. The Islamic Center in Tempe, Arizona, is located right off the main campuses of Arizona State University, one of the largest universities in the country. It's a small city in and of itself, and thousands of people attend that school, and thousands of foreign students attend Arizona State University. And a lot of them come from the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen, all the countries you can think of from the Gulf area. And so these guys were specifically targeting, Subra and Al-Sharbi, specifically targeting, these foreign Muslim students from the Gulf that were attending the Islamic Center Tempe for recruitment into their organization, which I believe this organization, the Al-Muhajirin, was also a vehicle that was being used to spot, assess, and to recruit individuals to go on to terrorist training camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan, in the years before 9/11 and then even after 9/11.
And this was information that you were receiving from your informant.
Yes, and that's what I want to stress. If there's any brand new agents out there listening to this, or agents in training, that you really need to pay attention and work on developing a good source base, no matter what kind of violation you're working on. We're talking about terrorism, but the same it holds true in general criminal investigations. I mean, you have to recruit people, and you have to get people on board Team USA, Team FBI, if you will, that are going to know the targets that you're chasing. So whether it be drugs, whether it be violent crime, major offender stuff, organized crime, outlaw motorcycle gangs, whatever, white collar crime. You have to be able to talk to people. You have to be able to sit down, talk to them. But more importantly, you have to listen to people. You have to be an active listener. I used to get aggravated sometimes when I'd see some agents and they just like to hear themselves talk. And you want to kick them under the table and say, hey, I can hear you talk all day long. I want to hear this person that we're talking to. I want to hear what they have to say, because these are people that are going to lead me to the bad guys. I want to hear the person that we're talking to speak. And you have to be an active listener. So this guy, the source that originally gave me this information, I don't know if you remember, Jerry, the old E.F. Hutton commercials. When E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens.
Yeah, I'm old. I remember it.
Yeah. There you go. And so that I looked at this particular source as like my E.F. Hutton, and like when he spoke, I listened to it. And this individual, he was he was grateful to be in America, and he had enough of this type of lifestyle when he was living in Syria and he was living in Lebanon, and he just wanted to live in peace. And, he realized America was the land of opportunity where he could believe what he wanted to believe as long as he didn't break the laws, and he could live a good and virtuous life in America. And he was just tired of living that way. And when he saw it, he thought it was like following here to the United States. When he saw it here in the United States, he spoke out. He saw something and he said something, like the old public announcement statements go today. If you see something, say something. And he did, and he was right. So we're talking now, we're moving in from 1999. So we're getting into the early 2000, late 1999. There was another situation that took place in Arizona, and it involved an American West airline flight. America West is defunct now. They're no longer flying, but they merged. I think they merged with U.S. Airways. But in 1999, a flight originating from Phoenix, Arizona to Washington, D.C. was there was 2 Saudi Arabian students on board. Both of them were PhD candidates. One was a PhD candidate that was attending Arizona State University, and another one who was attending the University of Arizona. They're PhD. They're going for their PhD, so they're intelligent individuals. So while on this flight from Phoenix to Washington, D.C., these guys started asking flight attendants very strange questions about the aircraft. They wanted to know about the fuel capacity of the aircraft. They wanted to know about all sorts of technical things about the airplane that the flight attendants thought odd. But the oddest thing that these guys did was they attempted to get up on the airplane, or they did get up on the airplane. They walked to the cockpit area of the airplane, and they tested the cockpit door. And they wanted to see, and when they were confronted and challenged by the flight crew, they said, "Oh, we thought that this was the bathroom." Now, I got to ask you this, and your audience this: how many of us have been on an airplane where we saw the toilet of a major airliner right there? It's off the side of the aircraft.
You can't miss it.
Yeah, you can't miss it. So, make a long story short, these guys were acting. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And the flight attendant radioed to the cockpit and said, "Look, we're not comfortable with these guys in the plane. Let's put down." So they put down in Columbus, Ohio, and these 2 individuals in question, a guy by the name of Mohammed Al-Qudaheen and a guy by the name of Hamdan Al-Shalawi, were detained by Columbus, Ohio Police Department, and were interviewed by the Columbus, Ohio Police Department and the FBI. The FBI maintains offices in most of the international airports in the country for instances just like this and other crimes that take place on board an aircraft. So these guys were interviewed at length, and they immediately went on the offensive, and they were claiming racial profiling, and they were saying that they were trying to shame law enforcement into not doing anything with them. And again, in the pre 9/11 world, other decisions were made during that time that, in hindsight, probably people wish they hadn't made. But it was like, oh man, we don't want to offend any country here. We don't want to offend these gentlemen. So they got them on board the plane as fast as they could, got them out of there. And what these 2 individuals did, they were greeted by Saudi Arabian government officials that were assigned to the embassy in Saudi Arabia, and they had a press conference in front of the Capitol steps of the U.S. Capitol, and basically were alleging that the FBI and the Columbus, Ohio Police Department were racially profiling these guys. And I have testified before the 9/11 Commission and in the Joint Intelligence Committee in Congress that we believe, after 9/11, we believe that this was probably most likely an intelligence collecting mission by these guys to be used by Al-Qaeda in their planning for the 9/11 attacks. And the reason why I say that is one of these guys, Hamdan al-Shalawi, we found his information after he left the United States to go back home. We found his information and stuff at a terrorism training camp in Afghanistan after the war took place. So he was affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and he had received explosives training by Al-Qaeda. So
when was the date of this again?
The flight was in 1999,
okay.
And this incident took place in 1999. So this is all like just a couple years before the 9/11 attacks. And what's interesting about this too is when we were looking at the two individuals in Prescott, Arizona, we found they were using Zachariah Subra and Ghassan al-Sharbi were utilizing Mr. al-Shalawi's vehicle, a vehicle registered to Mr. al-Shalawi as their vehicle to get around the state of Arizona. So you can see how the plot's thickening here. You got this guy that's gone this, what I will call casing operation in preparation for 9/11. You got that guy, who's making the big grandstand speech in front of the Capitol saying that the U.S. government's racially profiling and religiously profiling these guys and so on and so forth. You got that guy loaning the vehicle to the two guys that were attending Emory University who were founded in the organization Yom Hajarun in the state of Arizona and who were claiming to be the ears, the mouthpiece, and voice of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. They're using this al-Shalawi's car. So you can see as investigators, looking at this, I'm starting to see the beginning of what I would call, identify as a cell of something that's very of great interest to us.
I have to ask a question.
Yes.
When they went to juggle the handle of the cockpit door, were they able to open it? Was it locked?
No, it was locked. It was locked, and they weren't able to open it. They were definitely trying to gain access or to see if they could gain access. I do not believe that they were going to do anything on that day. I do believe, though, that was going to be intelligence that was going to be given to somebody else and say, hey, look, this is what we've done. Now, my question, and we weren't able to see, it might exist, Jerry, but I asked at the time, and I don't know, I got negative responses, but I remember we had asked other field offices at the time. We put memorandums out there, I forget what we called them then, airtels or whatever back then, and we said, hey, look, this is what we saw in this instance. Does any other offices have any information from their airport liaison people or their airport duty agents, where this is taking place in other cities? And at that time, we got a negative response. We didn't get any response back. But I would suspect, as a trained investigator in this field, that this wasn't probably the only flight that this took place on in the years and days leading up to 9/11. They were probably collecting intelligence information all over the place. And, thank goodness this flight crew, in my opinion, did the right thing and reported it, and we were able to address it. But so now let's think where we're at now in the timeline, continuing here. So now we're talking 1999. So what's happening in the United States at this time period? We are now going to be changing centuries, right? We're getting ready for Y2K. The clocks are going to change to 2000. And I know a lot of people probably forget about this now, but back in those days, Jerry, you probably remember this.
Yeah, I'm old. I remember.
Yeah, that's it. This was a big deal for us, because people in government really thought that if things could go haywire at 2000 with the computer information age, and people were concerned about, power grids going out, banking. It was chaotic. Yeah. So, the U.S. government stood up command posts, the whole nine yards in preparation for this. So at this time, I was ordered by headquarters to go interview Mr. al-Sharbi and Mr. Subra, and I said, look, it's a little too early yet. We're still just, I haven't really had an opportunity even to get surveillance coverage on them because, again, back in this time, we had other responsibilities and surveillance assets were precious, especially here in the southwest border. Most of them were being consumed with drug work. I couldn't get surveillance assets on these guys. So myself and another agent from the squad, we muster up some other guys and gals, and we go out and try to do our own surveillance on these. And we're pretty good. I mean, you're a trained FBI agent. I'm a trained FBI agent. We do what we can do. But there's nothing like having a dedicated surveillance team that does this day in and day out to get the job done right. So we did what we could do at the time and watched what we could watch. But I wasn't prepared to go do a really in-depth interview of these guys yet, because to do so would pretty much dime out my informant, and it was very, very risky. So we attributed, when orders are orders, we had to go do the interview. And subjects all over the country at this time were being interviewed in preparation for the, clock turning 12 at the end of 1999. And we did an interview. And we just basically came up with a ruse saying, we were interviewing all foreign students and stuff like this because of the Y2K thing. I know it sounds ridiculous now with the Y2K, but it was real. And as we went in here, and this is where your training and experience comes into play. And again, if any young agents are out there listening, whatever violation you're assigned, you got to take it seriously. And Uncle Sam's not going to teach you everything about it, so you're going to have to do some independent reading. You're going to have to do some self-education on your own to learn about your target. And in the pre-9/11 world, the FBI really didn't spend a lot of time training its agents. Sure, we had conferences and we had meetings and whatnot, but if you really wanted to learn about this stuff that you were assigned, more often than not, you would have to read on your own to get an understanding of this ideology, get an understanding of the culture, get an understanding of their religious convictions and beliefs, and go from there. So when myself and my partner went to this apartment, this Dell Motor Lodge, knocked on the door, they invited us in, and on the wall of their apartment, I could see, and again, based on my training and experience and my own education, a picture of an individual on a poster on one of the walls of their apartment. And I readily recognized this individual as being an individual known as Ibn Khattab. He's a Saudi Arabian guy, but he was a head of the Islamic Army of the Caucasus at the time that adhered to Al-Qaeda type of radical Islamic philosophy. And again, when I say Islamic philosophy, I certainly am not implying that Muslims are terrorists. I'm not. It's just a small faction within their religion that is causing the good, God-loving people problems. And I recognize this guy as being that Ibn Khattab guy, very dangerous man, who was conducting a jihad in Chechnya at the time, and at the time they were fighting Russian troops in the name of their God. And he was also a supporter of bin Laden. So we saw that picture, and then underneath the picture of Ibn Khattab, we saw pictures of wounded warriors, wounded mujahideen, religious warriors. And, and it was like a little shrine set up in front of these pictures where I could tell that the occupants of this apartment, Mr. Suber and Mr. Al-Sharbi, were kind of paying respect to these individuals, that they had taped to the wall. So I started the interview with them. Mr. Al-Sharbi was very quiet during the interview. On the other hand, Mr. Suber was a loudmouth. He was getting right into our grill. And he was trying to push all our buttons. He was saying, because I recognized the photo of Ibn Khattab, and he says, yes, he's a great Muslim, as is brother Osama bin Laden. They're great Muslim warriors, good people. And he looked at me and he said, without batting an eye, he considered myself, the other agent, the FBI in general, the U.S. military, and the U.S. government, and he went in that order, as quote unquote legitimate military targets of Islam.
Wow.
So,
way to
yes,
keep a low profile.
Exactly right. As an investigator, it really incenses you, because most foreign students that I had contacted prior to this in my FBI career, they were always kind of intimidated by us, and they were afraid of us, because especially people from that area of the world, the Middle East, because their intelligence services, their internal intelligence services, security forces are a little bit more hands-on with people. They don't have like the U.S. Constitution, and all this other stuff that prevent them from doing different things, bad things to people. And most students would greet me in the past like, and we say, no, we're not like the Mukhabarat from your country. We're just here to talk to you. We're not going to rough you up. We're not going to be bad to you. We just want to learn some things from you. But these guys were right in your grill and very aggressive. And as an investigator, I said, please just chest pump me, do something where I might be able to arrest you for assault on a federal officer or something. But they were smart enough not to go that far, but he made a statement. He made it clear that he considered me, the United States government, the FBI, U.S. military, as legitimate military targets of Islam. Again, right in your face. And in hindsight, when I conclude this, I'll tell you, probably Al-Qaeda hated him after that, after they became aware of the fact that this is what he did, because he really Now it's game on. We had source information saying that these guys were bad. Now he's demonstrated it to us, to our face. He has no fear, no intimidation, no respect for our authority, no respect for our country. And we said, this is the real deal. So this is what I'm confronted with at this time. So we're talking in 2000, this is where we're at. And right at the time we're doing these interviews, we start to get a series of arsons taking place in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And we had what the arsonist was doing was he was targeting houses that were under construction, brand new builds, located abutting mountain preserves, either state park stuff or county park stuff or city mountain preserves. And he was trying to give law enforcement the impression that he was some kind of eco-terrorist. And he would taunt law enforcement by contacting a local media branch out here, or he would leave like notes, somewhere in the area. And he was like taunting us, making us believe that he was an eco-terrorist. So immediately, the police were thinking, hey, this might be bigger than what we can handle here, because if this guy is in fact with a terrorist organization, an Earth First type group or some similar, similar group like that, we're going to need maybe the FBI's help on this. And so they approached the FBI, and our command at the time agreed to help them. And I can understand why. There was millions of dollars worth of damage. And fortunately, nobody had been hurt up to the point, but there's always that possibility that somebody could get killed during one of these burns.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Because I think people listening, it would be nice to give them an understanding of why a local law enforcement would need the FBI's help. What was it that you were going to be able to provide that the local agency, didn't have or, needed from the FBI?
As you know, Jerry, we have tremendous resources with respect to like our behavioral analytical units and stuff, agents that are trained to put together a psychological or psychiatric profile on somebody. We have surveillance assets. I mean, we have money, resources that local law enforcement might not have to keep surveillance airplanes in the air or things along those lines. We have technical assets with our tech agent corps that might be able to do some things that local law enforcement doesn't have the equipment or the training to do. And we have investigative resources that can help them. We have databases. We have computers that can help organize a major investigation to keep track of interviews, evidence, pieces of evidence collected at crime scenes, and so on and so forth. So that's why they would come to us. And they did in this case. And we agreed to help them out. What the subject in this case, his name is Mark Warren Sands, was signing some of his documents with and teasing the media with is he was calling himself a coalition to save the preserves. When the initial investigators were looking at this, they said coalition to save the preserves. They're automatically assuming that this is some kind of organized effort to, stop these buildings from going up near the preserve. So they were looking at it more than an individual. And here's the irony of ironies. And this is what I stress to those that are in management positions here. I was approached because I was an older investigator at the time, not senior. I mean, I only had like maybe 12 years in at the time that I was doing that. But I know that it's not a lot now when you look at it after serving 30 years. But I was like an older guy at the time and had experience working some other cases in the past. So I was ordered by my supervisor to be involved in that case and to put in a pending and active status the case of the guys that told me they thought we were legitimate military targets for Islam. And again, this was the pre-9/11 world. I mean, the thought process by the command at the time was that, hey, these guys are just propagating material out there, putting material out there. And yeah, they said some nasty words to you guys, but they haven't done anything. Meanwhile, we've got houses that are burning down. We've got people that could potentially get injured or killed during these fires. We need your help with this. So for your audience that doesn't know what pending and active is, that means the case is still going to be in an open status, but we're not going to actively conduct any investigation on it. All right, so basically it's a file sitting on a shelf somewhere, and no agent is looking at this. So these guys the guys that were attending Embry-Riddle University and who told me and the other agent that they considered us legitimate military targets for Islam and, that they thought bin Laden was a great brother and all this other stuff, were left unattended for over a year's period of time. So we don't know what took place during that that time period with these guys. I would occasionally touch bases with my source, and he would give me some updated information, but he wasn't really in with that group. He was older at the time. These guys were really targeting, people in their 20s, maybe late teens, early 20s. And my guy at the time was older, and they really didn't see much usefulness in him because although being a Muslim, he wasn't a really religious Muslim in their eyes. Here's a guy that you would like to go out and maybe grab a beer every once in a while, and they really wouldn't want anything to do with it. So for a year, and this is what I want to emphasize, maybe a little over a year, I wasn't looking at these guys. That in hindsight now, that we should have been looking at those guys because these were real Al-Qaeda guys, right? So we're looking at this arson guy, getting back to the arsonist, and we give the information that we had collected up to that time to the investigative team. It was a big investigative effort, and I'm telling you, I was very proud of my involvement in the arson case. In hindsight, it makes me sick for reasons that I'll get into later, but I'm not mocking the seriousness of the arson case at all. It was a very important case to be worked and whatnot, and the team that was assembled to work that case did a phenomenal investigative job, and I think it was a textbook example of how the FBI and a major police department, in this case the Phoenix Police Department and the Phoenix Fire Department, worked as one to bring a man to justice. And we put him away for like 25 years. But before we found out who he was, using the FBI resources, we had requested a behavioral science unit. For those of you in the audience that don't know, it's like the Criminal Minds show. That these are the guys and gals that profile criminals that we're interested in trying to identify. What makes a person do a particular crime? What, based upon the evidence that we collected to date, that we can share with them, what type of profile would you put together of the individual that we should be looking for? So the behavioral science unit did a phenomenal job on this case. And when we got the results back, Jerry, they did everything but give me the guy's name, hair color, and whether or not he had blue eyes, dark eyes, or green eyes. I mean, they said that this guy was going to have some kind of sexual deviant behavior, that he was not a member of a terrorist organization. And I think this is very important, very critical.
Now, how would they know that? You're going to have to tell us that, because it does sound like eco-terrorism.
Yeah, it did, and they had given some, and they use psychological words and all this other stuff that I'm not a psychologist. I can't remember the words they use, but they said based on their previous experiences of looking at cases like this, that this is what they have found, that it's people that are, based upon some of his rantings in the media and some of the stuff that he would write. I don't know how they came to like, again, not being a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I don't know how they came to this conclusion, but they did, and they felt strong enough to give our SAC and our investigative team this assessment. And I tell you, we didn't listen to it. We did not listen to it. And because the majority of people at the time were saying, no, this has got to be an eco-terrorist group. Because at this time period, and I forget where else in the country, there weren't necessarily arsons, but there were other eco-terrorist groups that were doing things around the country during this time period. And again, that not being my forte, domestic terrorism side of the house, I'm not familiar with the names of all those groups. My area of expertise for my entire bureau career was dealing with the Sunni Islamic extremists, the Al-Qaedas, the Al-Gama Islamiyas, the Hamas, those organizations, not, the Earth Firsters or those type of groups. I'm not very well versed in that. And that was another argument I had made to my supervisor at the time. I said, sir, listen, I said, I appreciate the confidence you have in me to help with this investigation, but I don't know anything about these organizations. I mean, it's like, you're taking me, I'm going to have to learn, and I have no aversion to learning. I mean, learning is always it's a very good thing. I felt like somebody that maybe you could bring somebody in from somewhere else in the country that has more of a knowledge of these type of people and their mindsets, than me, because I have none. But they didn't want to do that, and I was put on the case. And, it's a good agent, as you well know, Jerry. You do what the boss tells you to do. So
for the needs of the bureau,
exactly, for the needs of the bureau. So went kicking and screaming a little bit, but I helped out, and we ultimately ended up solving the case through a great team effort. And I forget what the statistic was at the time, but I think, and don't quote me on this, but it was very low. I want to say 4%, less than 4% of these type of cases that are committed, law enforcement actually makes an arrest on them. All right. And I don't know how they come to that 4% number, but I remember it was very low. So I remember the team, we were all celebrating when we arrested this guy. and that we actually accomplished something that not many law enforcement agencies or teams are able to do when we have these type of cases. And sure enough, when he was caught, and I won't bore your audience with how he was caught, we just had what we did. I'll tell you what the FBI did.
Yeah, we're not going to be bored. We need to know.
Okay, I'll tell you what the FBI did with the Phoenix Police Department, Phoenix Fire Department. We actually secured a piece of land on a border preserve area, abutting a border preserve area, and we pretended like we were going to build a house on this piece of land. We dumped lumber on that land. We put up a big billboard, not a big billboard, but like a, on construction sites when you see, hey, this is what's coming soon type of picture, type of thing. This is what we put on there. And on that billboard, on that sign of what we were going to build, we had an architect draw us what the most gaudiest house that you can think of. Beautiful, but gaudy, and we knew that this was going to maybe trigger something in our suspect's mind, whoever he or she was at the time. We didn't know who it was. And we were going to expect that they were going to show up at that sign and look at it. All right. And in the sign, we had microscopic cameras and microphones to identify who it is that would stop by and look at the photo or look at what was going to be built there. And that's how we identified our suspect, Mark Sands, at the time. We identified it because we caught him going up to that sign and tagging the sign with graffiti. And we were able to identify him after we got his picture, and we canvassed the neighborhood, and we were watching, and we identified him. It was good gumshoe detective work and surveillance work that located him.
The graffiti say?
Oh, it was something about the Gaudi houses and, Coalition to Save the Preserve type stuff, just a bunch of the nonsense. But
so basically, when he tagged the sign, he basically identified himself. I'm the one.
Pretty much.
I'm this organization.
Yep, pretty much.
Cool.
And hey, this is what we look for, right, Jerry? Is investigators. They're not all that bright sometimes. And he was he was very good, but we catch them when they make a mistake, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And this is how they go down. So we identify him, and sure enough, when we caught him, it was Phoenix Police Patrol officers that caught him. Did a phenomenal job catching him at the scene. He was in his underwear. I got called, as well as a Phoenix Police Department detective, Bob Ragsdale, legend. The guy that was a legend in the Phoenix Police Department, was a homicide detective, was here forever, very well respected. So both him and I were on call. We were the ones that ended up taking him off of patrol when they took him down to Phoenix PD's headquarters, and we conducted the interview of this guy with another large contingent of interviewers sitting in an adjoining room watching video feed of our interview.
You got to back up again. Why was he in his underwear?
Well, this is where I'm getting at.
Oh, okay.
He lived in the neighborhood where this house was going to be built, lived like a block or two away. And what we found out after we arrested this guy, and I could see when he was standing in the street, I could observe on the front of his dark blue boxer shorts what appeared to be dried semen stains on his shorts. And I remember what the behavioral science report was saying about, hey, when you catch this guy, or not when you catch this guy is going to be a sexual deviant. He's going to like to masturbate. He's going to like to do this. He's going to like to do that. And I did think of that report, and I go, that's potential evidence right there. I said, so when we put him in an orange jumpsuit, we bagged and tagged that underwear for whatever future use for later on. We took him down to police headquarters, where Bob and I conducted an interview of him. And I'm telling you, he was one of the most interesting individuals I've ever interviewed in my life. I mean, I have interviewed when I was a police officer and then as an FBI agent up to that point, literally hundreds of people. And he stands out, and he will always stand out in my mind as being one of the most interesting guys I've ever interviewed, because his emotions ran the gamut from childlike to almost feminine-like to badass-like, and then back, run the whole circle. And as I'm doing the interview with Bob, and we take a break from here, and then I go, is this guy doing this by design to make himself out to look like he's mentally ill, or is this what we're really dealing with? Is he really, psychotic? What is this guy? And we really didn't get much out of the interview. And the investigation continued with other agents afterwards, and they were able to get him to admit his involvement in things through another source that I had nothing to do with. It was other agents that had things to do with, and they got body recordings of him making some incriminating statements, and he ultimately got convicted and put away for like 25 years. And he recently got out. I'll talk to you about him towards the end, what he's doing now. But when we did get him, he was pretty much everything that the behavioral science unit said he was. When we executed search warrants in his home, we found all sorts of pornography. His wife admitted to us that he was addicted to porn. His now adult girl has admitted recently to the Arizona Republic, Jen Feifeld, the reporter, that her dad was a sex addict. He needed help, and all that stuff at the time. And he was everything that our behavioral science people thought he was. And that's where my respect went even higher for those men and women in our behavioral science unit, because they called it. And you know what? Again, I don't want to, hindsight's always 20/20, and I'm not being critical when I say this, but shame on us for not listening to our own people. Our own experts said, this is not eco-terrorism. This is this. And we chose to ignore that advice at the time. And the reason why that pains me right now is when I get on with my story, you'll see why it pains me. Because it took my eyes off some guys that were involved with people that did that horrible thing on September 11th, committed that horrible crime and that act of terrorism September 11th, 2001. So moving along.
Are you saying that you may have been able to solve that arson sooner and return to the case?
That's $1 million question. I don't know if we would have been able to do it any sooner, but I think we might have been able to, how do I want to put it, did away with a lot of confusion and trying to build things up into something that they weren't. Dedicate some resources on it. But my point being, don't take your international terrorism agents off of international terrorism to work this arson case. All right. We got to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. And my message to any managers that might be listening to this is listen to your experts in your respective fields. I mean, if you've got agents assigned to work international terrorism, this is where all the government's resources is educating me. And when you send me to in-services, when you send me to training, it's to learn about those guys, not about arsonists. And when your agents tell you, when it was me, I told my supervisor, and he's a great guy, and we're still the best of friends. I said, Billy, you're making a mistake, man. These guys are the real guys. I mean, I've been looking at this stuff for years, and I said, I've never seen a foreign student look me in the eye and say, I consider you a legitimate military target of Islam. He's not saying he doesn't like me. He's basically saying, I'm a target. He would like to kill me. And people like me and like our country. And as that is extremely significant, right? In our business, this is what we would call a quote unquote clue.
Yeah.
This is real deal. Yeah. So I'm always very careful how I phrase this, because I am not casting any type of dispersion on that arson case. It was a horrible set of crimes. Many people were seriously financially hurt on this deal. People could have been killed on this deal. What I'm merely suggesting, Jerry, is that don't use your experts in other fields and have them not look at what they're trained to do onto something that they're not trained to look at. I mean, I was afraid when I initially got assigned to the arson case that I said, I'm going to be a liability here because, first of all, I've never worked an arson case. Secondly, I don't know anything about these domestic terrorist groups. Right after the attacks on 9/11, and I'll talk about that in a minute, we had guys and gals, God bless them, that were assigned to work international terrorism stuff, and they're great agents. Every FBI agent we can do miraculous things when we put our heads to it. But the learning curve was huge, so you have maybe agents that are coming in and had never even talked to somebody from the Middle East that are used to talking to, like, let's say, Hispanic or black gangbangers, that are on the street dealing dope, shooting it up. Very bad guys, and don't get me wrong. But now we're asking them to do something that they have no background on. I was the lead case agent, on you will, after 9/11 for the Phoenix response to it, because as we go on in my presentation here, we had 2 terrorists living here. So getting back to the timeline here, so now we're talking December 2000. We have Hani Hanjour and Nawaf Al-Hazmi, 2 of the hijackers that were on American Airlines Flight 77 that went into the Pentagon on that fateful day, arrive in Arizona. So at the time period when I'm looking after this arsonist, we have 2 of our hijackers, one Hanjour being the pilot, Al-Hazmi being one of the muscle men on Flight 77, arrive in our area of operation, arrive right here in Phoenix, Arizona. So we're not watching the guys from Prescott. We're not watching the guys that were on the America West Airlines flight, who we subsequently found out had gone to an Al-Qaeda terrorist training camp. We're not watching these guys. So this is where I've done some real soul searching, and I'm a Christian man, so I believe in things, and I don't beat myself. I used to beat myself over the head with it all the time. What did we miss during this time period? What did we miss? What could have we seen if I wasn't working this arson case and I was left to work these guys in Prescott and the guys that were on the America West Airlines flight? Would I have identified the two hijackers that came into the area? Would they have met up with the individuals that we were already looking at, who, when they came here, we weren't looking at anymore? And that's the $1 million question I'll have to the day I die. Could we have seen them? And had we been able to identify Nawaf al-Hazmi, he had been watch listed. He was one of the individuals that got away from the Central Intelligence Agency. He was part of a meeting in Malaysia, before they arrived into the United States. The U.S. intelligence lost him, but he was on our watch list. So had I been able to identify him and did some basic data checks that we do as part of a standard counterterrorism investigation, he would have came to my attention as being a watch listed guy who was a member of Al-Qaeda. To answer your question earlier, that's the question that always haunts me. I finally have come to the conclusion. I've been retired now 2 years. I do believe that God has a plan for everybody and has a reason for everything happening. So I'm not as rough on myself as I used to be on this, because I would always ask myself, should I have protested more to my supervisors? Should I have, not been a good team player, and I've come to the conclusion, no, I did what I was told, and I did it for the right reasons. And, sometimes fate, you have no control over fate, and things just happen. But during this time period, nobody was looking at these guys. I strongly believe, Jerry, that had we continued to focus in on the guys in Prescott, Arizona, and I've testified this to Congress and to the Blue Ribbon and 9/11 Commission inquiry into the events of September 11th, I do believe that we would have been able to identify these two individuals, because these guys in Prescott, they hung in those circles and they knew people in common with the two hijackers. And I will guarantee you that had we been surveilling them, it would have been very likely, probably probable, that we would have been able to identify these guys. But what have, could have, should have, that's hindsight. And I know hindsight can always be 20/20, but that's my reality, and that's what I believe. After the arrest of Mark Sands, I tidied up my stuff on the arson case, passed off some stuff to some other people because, we had our target, and he was in jail, and that was just administrative stuff that needed to be done in that arson case, and other agents were going to take care of that.
Yeah, let me just stop you real quick. Again, I always try to make sure we'll use this as a teaching opportunity, a teaching moment. And because the FBI came in to offer assistance, there was still no federal jurisdiction in this particular investigation. So even though agents continued working, I take it that everything as far as the next level with prosecution or whether he pled or whatever was all handled by the state.
Correct. Yes. So after that got wrapped up, I went back to work with these guys up in Prescott. And now, like I said, I'm over a year behind on what they're up to, the whole 9 yards. I'm really behind, and I got to play catch up. So in reviewing the file and reviewing the work that I had previously done on it before we put it into pending and active status, I started to notice other things in preparation to get going full board on my case again on these guys. And I was coming up with other information from around the state where we had other instances of individuals that were like-minded as the two guys in Prescott, that, like-minded, I mean, in being in support of bin Laden, in support of the global jihad and that whole militant form of Islam. And I said, boy, and they were going to flight schools, and they were also studying in different areas of the state, aviation related stuff, and I'm going, this is strange, so I authored what has become known as the Phoenix Memo, and I compiled a list of the cases that came to my attention after I got back to work and the guys in Prescott, and I said, look at. This is just strange. I mean, it's an anomaly, and we all know that, Jerry. You're looking at a case, and sometimes, you don't see it immediately, and then all of a sudden the light bulb goes off, and you go, "This is strange. There's a pattern developing here. There's something going on here." How many of these kids from the Middle East that are coming here that have this radical ideology? They're spewing vitriol about America and Israel and all this other stuff, and they're studying civil aviation stuff. They're learning how to fly airplanes. They're learning how to fix airplanes. They're learning how to get security jobs at airports, and stuff like that. I mean, this looks like a trend developing. So I put together what has now become the Phoenix Memo, and I said, look, I think, bin Laden has got a cadre of individuals in the United States where he is, he's possibly going to use to target U.S. civil aviation, and I wasn't thinking at the time about planes being used as missiles, to be, kamikaze type attacks. I was thinking more along like the old line stuff, where, we saw the Libyans blow up Pan Am 103, where they were going to plant the bomb in an airplane or something like that. I did not envision at that time that these planes would be used as missiles, even though the U.S. government had information, going back to the mid-'90s with an operation called Boyjenka, where Ramzi Youssef, the famed Ramzi Youssef terrorist who participated in blowing up the first World Trade Center bombing back in 1993, him and his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who we all know now was the mastermind of September 11th, were planning on crashing a bunch of airliners into the California or the western coast of the United States. They were going to upwards of 13 aircraft to do this. So that information was out there. I was just not aware of that information at the time. And this was all, like I said, pre 9/11, and the information sharing, let's say, or our communication systems weren't all the best. They were good, but they weren't what they are today. I wasn't aware of that, sitting here in the deserts of Phoenix, Arizona. So the U.S. government did have information before 9/11 that this is what the enemy had intended to do at least once. So it shouldn't come as no surprise that they didn't give up their desire to carry out such a horrific attack. So we put it out there, and we floated out there on July 10th, 2001. So when we get to September, I'm arriving into the office, and all FBI offices have like the night watch, the night clerks area, and that's where all the TVs are and all the other stuff. And I'm getting off the elevator, I'm going into the office in downtown Phoenix, and the night clerk says to me, "Hey, look at Ken." He says, "A small plane just crashed into the World Trade Center." And as we're watching it, we see the other aircraft crash into the other tower, and I'm going, "This is Al-Qaeda." And I remember getting on my phone, calling my supervisor up. I said, "Hey, we got to take about 10 agents, and we got to go to Embry-Riddle University, and we got to locate these guys that are members of that organization," because by that time, these guys had recruited about 10 other individuals at the university up there to be part of the Al-Muhajirun organization. And I tell you, Jerry, it was the worst feeling I ever had in my life, because on the drive up there, like I said, it's about 150 miles north of Phoenix, and we were flying up there. We were rolling code up there. And I just kept thinking to myself, Lord, please let all the guys that we had identified in that communication, let us have them. Let them be where they're supposed to be.
And were you were thinking that they were on the plane?
Yes. Yep. And the same. And I was also thinking of the guys that were on the America West Airlines flight too. So we had people trying to locate them too. So I mean, I said, this is not good. That's my mindset on that fateful day. And we found everybody but two. And the two guys that we initially contacted, we rounded up right away. We just kept an eye on them, interviewed them, interrogated them, the whole nine yards. But we couldn't find two, and then we subsequently found them within the 24-hour period in another state. And so everybody that was listed in my memo was accounted for. But here's where we go from there. And this is what I want the audience and I want you to know. Hindsight is always 20/20, but like I said, this has just been my fate. I'm going to what if myself to death about what could have happened, or maybe what would have happened, until the day I die. But in 2002, we hit, when I say we, U.S. government, with the assistance of Pakistani intelligence officials, we hit a house in Faisalabad, Pakistan, looking for, at the time, we believed him to be a significant player. After his arrest, he wasn't really that significant. He was significant. He was a bad guy that we took off the battlefield, but he wasn't as high as U.S. intelligence originally thought. We took a guy by the name of Abu Zubaydah off in an apartment in Faisalabad, Pakistan. A gunfight ensued. Abu Zubaydah was wounded, seriously wounded. And who's cowering in the corner of this, at that time, one of the world's most hunted guys, that the World Intelligence Services was trying to find, was Ghassan al-Sharbi, the Saudi kid from Embry-Riddle University. Now, I submit to you this, and this is what I've told Congress, this is what I've told the Blue Ribbon 9/11 Commission. Nobody that held the position like Abu Zubaydah did at the time would let any person that they did not think significant hang out with them in their hideout. All right. So here's this guy from Embry-Riddle University who he and his friend primarily the Big Mouth, said, I consider you a legitimate military target of Islam. Here we find him cowering in the corner after a gunfight where his good buddy Abu Zubaydah was wounded. Ghassan al-Sharbi is now known as detainee number 682. So he's been in custody in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba since 2002. I have had the opportunity to go down and interrogate him several times in Guantanamo. He is hardcore. This quiet, meek guy, when we were interviewing him, remember his big mouth Lebanese friend was doing all the talking when we were interviewing him. He was quiet during the course of the interview, is now like a cell block leader down there with these extremists. And I wish every American could see like our interview and interrogation of this guy, because it would remind people. And I think we made a mistake by not filming them regularly, because I would love to use it as a teaching method to young FBI agents in Quantico and other agents that go to training, in-service trainings, to learn how to talk to these people. But it was remarkable. There were times when I thought I almost had him where he was going to talk to us. When he got taken into custody, and Al-Qaeda was kind of, I won't say coming apart at the seams, but they were in a state of disarray because the U.S. government really put a whooping on them. We were really hitting them hard militarily in Afghanistan. And they were starting to lose control over some things. And I don't know if you remember, they started a bombing campaign in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And they were targeting Westerners, and they were targeting all sorts of things. But they were ending up killing a lot of Saudi Arabian citizens too, kids. I had requested from our legal attaché in Saudi Arabia at the time, I said, get me some gruesome crime scene photos in Saudi Arabia, especially involving children. Now, for your audience, it's not because I'm some kind of ghoul. I'm using this as a interview and interrogation technique, because my subject, Ghassan al-Sharbi, who was sitting in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, had a 10-year-old brother, that he was very close to, and loved a great deal. Understandably so, it's your brother. And so I when we were sitting there talking to Ghassan, who speaks impeccable English, I told him, I said, look, I respect you as a warrior going to war with us. I'm saying this just to get him, feeling comfortable with me. I don't believe that, of course. And I said, but I said, while I honor you for being a soldier of Al-Qaeda, I said, when you were targeting governments and other legitimate targets, I threw that word out there again, legitimate. I said, look what they're doing now. They're killing Saudi kids. And I showed those pictures to him. And he looked at them. He looked at me. He started crying, and he started to say some things that I thought, we've got him. He's going to start talking to me now about how he was recruited, who else in Arizona. Did he meet the hijackers in Arizona? All sorts of stuff, and then this is where I wish I had it videotaped. It's like an aura came across him. And there's no other way to explain it. And his eyes glazed over, and he started reciting in the Quran, verse by verse. And then we lost him. And he's never talked to anybody. But what he did say to me before he got to that point was, he goes like this. He says, Ken, you have to realize something. He goes, you guys, since I've been in your custody, have screwed with my brain enough. Had they brought you down, meaning me, because we knew him, we had interviewed him twice before, all right? And he goes like this, he goes, I would have talked to you. But he says, you guys have been playing games with me. And I use that as another learning point. Like, I've told former Director Mueller this, I've told, again, the commissions this and the Congress this. I said, in the future, God forbid if we ever find ourselves in this type of situation again, I hope it never happens, ever, an attack on the likes of 9/11. But I go like this, I go, when these people are former FBI subjects or they're FBI subjects, and we've talked to them before, no other intelligence community agency should be given the opportunity to talk to them before us, because we've already established some sort of rapport. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but we're the quote unquote friendly face. We're the face. We're the person that he has spoken with before. There's another thing, that I regret. Had we been given that opportunity, I'm fairly certain that Mr. al-Sharbi would have spoken to us. Now, if you do a Google search on him today, you're going to find out that recently he has made, he's tried to reach out. He's tried to reach out to the government. He says he's willing to talk, because he sees what the Saudi government has been accused of doing here recently with the killing of Khashoggi, the journalist, with the 9/11 lawsuit in New York, targeting the Saudi Arabian government for their complicity. Some of their officials either knowingly or unknowingly given the hijackers money. And he says, now you guys know what the Saudi government's all about. And he says, and I'd like to talk to you guys about them. And so I'm hoping somebody, now I'm out 2 years. I mean, I don't have a need to know anymore. But I mean, I hope that somebody has taken him up on his offer just to go listen to him. Granted, he might be trying to influence us as well as inform us. But I hope we didn't turn off the earpiece. I hope we've given him the opportunity to say something. But I want your listeners to know that, again, here's another situation where two worlds collided. The arson case and this case. This guy that was at Embry-Riddle University was arrested with, at the time, the number 3 guy in Al-Qaeda after a gunfight in Pakistan. And what we found out after we had him in custody was that he was planning on coming back to the United States and working with his buddy Zachariah Subr, the Lebanese guy. He was planning on coming back to the United States, and he was going to conduct a series of bombings in the United States. He was going to be putting improvised explosive devices in places. We don't know, never identified the places. We never know how big, what type of devices he was going to use. We suspect maybe laptop computers, but he was wanting to come back to the United States to conduct terror activity, and thank goodness that raid in Pakistan prevented him from doing so. We do know that when he was in terror training camps in Afghanistan, that he was learning how to build improvised explosive devices. But here's a case where, from a management perspective, and I was manager for a very short period of time. Nothing against the career development path, but I just didn't like managing. I'd rather be working the cases. But here's a situation where we have to learn how to chew gum and walk at the same time, because there's no telling what we might have been able to prevent or what could have happened, if Mr. El-Sharbi didn't get captured in Pakistan. He had intentions to come back here to kill Americans, and we took our eyes off the ball for over a year. I don't think that we would ever have that scenario happen again, because 9/11 has, as you well know, significantly changed the way in which the FBI handles these type of cases and, matters. And so I don't ever see, Ken Williams' situation being replicated in the future, because it took a horrific event like 9/11 to change things,
Well, I'm thinking about the mass shootings that have occurred, and we are still sometimes second guessed because of information that later was learned that we had some access to, and so there are still questions about the ability of the FBI to obtain information, be able to figure out what this is and stop things. I hope I'm not making excuses or defending the FBI unfairly, but trying to stop things that no one would have any idea or any prediction, even for you, if your memo, which of course was 5 pages long, you never thought that it was going to be planes that were going to be used as missiles or bombs.
No, not at all. You're absolutely right. But you know what? This is where somebody that was aware of that Operation Boyjanka thing, that was being thought of in the mid 1990s, 95, if they had seen that communication, would have said, oh, yeah, they were trying to do something like this back in 1995. The guy might be onto something. You know what I'm saying? I didn't see it. But I remember talking to Director Mueller once, and, I consider him a friend. He's a nice man, treated me very nicely. But one of the things that I remember telling him, and if he's listening to this, I don't know if you remember this, Mr. Mueller, but I remember telling him, I said, sir, since we have now doubled the number of agents that are working counterterrorism information, the likelihood of us coming across names of individuals that are going to do something in the future has significantly increased. And it's very likely, probably probable, that it will happen. I said, you have to start briefing the Congress, and even more importantly, talking to the American people in an open forum, during interviews, news media interviews, during public speeches, that's a distinct possibility. So that people, when that does happen, as it did with the Sarnev brothers in Boston during the marathon, they'll know that we can't be everywhere 24/7, 365 days a year. So it kind of eases the blow to the American people and to our elected officials who might want to point the finger at us and say, well, you knew something about them. Why didn't you do anything about it? So I think we need to sensitize people in elected office and to the general public that, yeah, the FBI does a great job collecting information. And we Jerry, as well as I do, it's like trying to drink a sip of water out of a fire hydrant, a gushing fire hydrant. There's so much information that comes into us that it's virtually impossible to address everything. The best that you can hope for is that a case agent, a manager, an analyst will look at something and say, and be able to connect maybe one other dot to something to say, yeah, we got to run on this real hard. Because, to run on everything real hard, what I saw happening was a little bit like this. And this is just Ken Williams' opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the FBI. I'm speaking on my own opinion. I started to see a little bit of burnout. All right. What I mean by this is when everything's an emergency, nothing is an emergency over a period of time. And as much as we all want to get out there and really make sure we prevent something, when that is every day, it was really like that after 9/11 for a long period of time. And guys and gals did a phenomenal job. And one day history will be written about that time period, and Americans will realize how much was actually prevented from taking place in this country. But now, as we are approaching almost 20 years after the fact, the information that comes in is still tremendous. It's still a tremendous amount of information. Guys of my generation who are now retired and guys that are just getting, gals that are just getting ready to retire have had 20 years of like fire drills. You know what I'm saying? It takes a toll on people. And my biggest fear is that burnout will happen and people will miss something, and it's going to happen again. Because I can tell you one thing about this enemy, and I'm specifically speaking about Al-Qaeda. They are very patient. Us in the West are impatient. We like instantaneous results. These people look at things in terms of centuries, not years. I mean, so 18, 19 years ago is not a long time ago for them. So I believe in my heart of hearts that they're sitting around somewhere plotting and scheming and considering conducting a more horrific attack than September 11th. Because if you look at the history of Al-Qaeda, you will see since their inception, since their beginning, every attack that they've taken upon the United States has been bigger than the previous one. 9/11 is pretty horrific. So what they may have planned in store for us in the future is darn right frightful.
Yeah, because that sends shivers up my.
Yeah, it's downright frightful because these guys were in all sorts of academic disciplines. And not just aviation. These guys were in chemical, biological fields. I mean, all sorts of things. So if you put your thinking man's cap on, thinking woman's hat on, and you say, boy, if I'm an Al-Qaeda guy and I got a chemistry degree, or if I got a nuclear degree, what am I capable of doing in the name of the cause? And as a counterterrorism agent, that's the way you need to look at it. So if you develop a cell like these guys that we had at Prescott and you look at their academic backgrounds, well, for me, it was evident that they were maybe wanting to do something with airplanes or at airports.
Well, let me ask you a question, because when you first started your story, I think some people would have assumed that the people that you initially met in Prescott were actually on the plane, and they weren't. Yeah, no. So what were all of those extra people here for, just as support?
That's the $1 million question. I personally, and again, this is just my belief, all right, and it is just based upon my knowledge of the field here. I mean, like you go back to 1995, if they were planning on doing 13 planes during that time period, like in Operation Boyjanka, I encourage your listeners to look that up on the internet. I think it was upwards of 13 planes. I apologize if it's one or two less or one or two more, but on September 11th, they only used 4. So this is what I believe, and I've also given my opinion to the 9/11 Commission and the Congress on this too. I believe that based upon the events that were happening in the United States prior to 9/11, the FBI Phoenix interviewing this guy Suber and El Sharbi in Phoenix, Arizona, and rattling their cage a little bit here, what Harry Samet and others were doing in Minneapolis with Zacharias Moussaoui in the months leading up before 9/11, that the Al-Qaeda leadership got rattled. And they said, hey, it's go time. It's go now or no go at all. Because I really do believe, although it hasn't never been admitted to by any of the leadership in Al-Qaeda that we have in custody, all right, that's the case. But I think that they sped up the attacks. Because why would you go from planning something as massive as with 13 aircraft and just settle on 4? I think they really thought that things might have been unraveling.
And why are all these extra people here studying at these aviation universities?
Yep. And Jerry, the other good point.
Interesting.
And the other thing that I tell people, there's a situation that just took place. I think it was in the Philippines. Don't quote me on this. Just within the past couple of weeks, where there's a guy by the name of Omar El-Bayoumi who was, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, he was a critical player in the LA, San Diego area at the time. that actually hosted or is accused of, helping two of the hijackers, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, one of the guys that was living here in Phoenix, Arizona for a period of time, get settled in San Diego. Yeah, I don't know if you remember that big controversy, and that was a big deal. They were allegedly living in the home of an FBI informant, and that was another big deal because that went unnoticed and unchecked. My point being is that Omar al-Bayoumi, his son was recently arrested either in Taiwan or Thailand. It's one of those places because he was learning how to fly with other extremists, Muslim extremists. So, I mean, when I saw that, again, it put a chill up my back. I go, here we are, we're on generation number 2, and these guys are still dabbling around with airplanes, and still maybe wanting to do something dastardly. And nothing changes. And that's why we have to maintain our vigilance with these guys. I do some stuff still with the FBI, like I'll teach some new guys and gals on how to look at these guys and work these guys. I've been invited to attend a counterterrorism symposium in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in June of this year. Got contacted by the FBI's International Operations Division, asked me if I'd like to go down and talk to their group, and I'm going to do it. But one of the things, these guys, they are dedicated to bringing us down, hurting us. All right. And you just don't give that up by the killing of Osama bin Laden. It's an ideology. It's not an individual. It's an ideology. And these people still have that ideology. It's not going away anytime soon. And Americans need to be prepared to continue to put their thumb on this target and to keep Americans safe. Because look at our friend, Mr. Subra, getting back to the Phoenix Memo, right? What was he studying? He was studying aviation security. So think of him like today. If we weren't on him, he could be the head of security at an international airport anywhere in the United States, in Europe, Asia, Africa, and allowing Al-Qaeda operatives to do something dastardly to airplanes. That's just one scenario. Electrical engineering as it relates to aviation, like Subra was studying, or El-Sharbi was studying. All right, now we know he was going to make improvised explosive devices with that stuff, but he could have learned electrical engineering in any other school in the United States. Why an aviation school? Are they teaching their people how to, do something faulty with wiring, to wire an airplane wrong if they get a mechanics degree, or they get some sort of job at an airport or an airline to service their airlines, by working on their electrical wiring? Is he going to deliberately be able to bring an airplane down by doing that? And the list goes on and on and on. And that's just in aviation. I mean, think of the other disciplines where we've known that these guys have gotten degrees, and it's downright frightening. There's a lot of people now, and God bless them for wanting to work for our great agency, the FBI, but they were kids when 9/11 happened. They don't remember really the details of that. I mean, they were in grammar school, and now they're becoming FBI agents. And older guys like me and you, older agents, need to remind them that this stuff is out there, and you got to keep the pressure on, and you got to be always being creative and trying to figure out. I would always ask myself, what would I do if I were a terrorist? What would I do? How would I do it?
I think the most frightening thing is to recognize that next year, in 2021, is the 20th year anniversary. And I would imagine if you are looking to do something, that would be a great date to do it. It's absolutely frightening.
It's so true. And, listen, we have done some things. I say we, I'm talking we as a culture, not specifically the FBI. We have done some things to increase the safety of our flying public. But in my professional opinion, as well as my personal opinion, not nearly enough. I mean, I don't think the American people would ever put up with the type of security that, let's say, for instance, that El Al imposes on their customers when they're flying into Israel. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure of flying on an El Al flight. I mean, excellent airline. The security is tremendous. I mean, when I've flown them once, and it was the most enjoyable flight I've ever had. I don't mean to sound like I'm an ad for El Al airline, but the security, I mean, I just felt once I went through the security, I was safe on that airplane. Now, I hate to say this about our own situation here at home, but I don't feel any more safer on getting on an airplane today than I did pre 9/11 or immediate post 9/11 world.
Wow,
I really don't.
That's saying a lot. Well, I was just in Europe in September, and I do know that in in Paris that they actually stopped, I would say, at least a third of everyone that came through, including me, and went through my suitcase.
Yeah.
And it was a surprise and it was inconvenient, but boy, I did feel a lot safer
Yes.
knowing
Yeah.
how much time they spent on actually going through bags, not
Yep.
just looking at, an x-ray.
And when you're in Israel, if you ever had the pleasure to go there, I've spent a lot of my career over there. When you're getting on a flight over there, I mean, they're profiling you in line, and they're sending security personnel, security professionals that have been trained in profiling and have been trained in interviewing to see how you're going to respond. I mean, so if anybody's up to no good, I mean, they got to have nerve of steel, because these guys are going to make, and these guys and these gals are going to make you a little uncomfortable as you're waiting to get on an airplane. Now, I can't see that taking place in the United States. First of all, we're like 10 times the size of the state of Israel, and it would significantly delay air traffic. But my point being, and this is where I'm going with it, I'm not being critical of our aviation security. I'm being realistic. It's still a vulnerable target. And they got a big bang for their buck on that target. No pun intended when I say that. But I mean, they got a lot accomplished on that for less than the average cost of a home. And let's say, I think the saying was back in the day in Virginia, like $500,000 or whatever, they were able to put this country into 2 wars. We spent our precious resources in our young people's blood, lives, countless millions and millions, hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars in warfare, destroying countries, all for like $500,000. I mean, so that the return that they got on their investment was tremendous. So there would be no reason, if I were a terrorist leader, that I would want to do that again. And that should make people nervous. I'm not a doom and gloomer. I'm not a chicken little, the sky's falling type of guy. But that's
let me ask you straight out. Do you think we're safe? Are safer?
I think we're safer from the standpoint of this. With the reorganization of the Bureau, in the years after 9/11, I know a lot of our colleagues did not like a lot of the reorganization, but it needed to be done. It was either had to be us, or it was going to be a whole new organization that was going to be created. There were senators after 9/11 that wanted to take this responsibility away from the FBI, which I thought would have been a tremendous responsibility, and create a whole other organization. To some extent they did with the Department of Homeland Security, okay, but they still had trust and confidence in the FBI and left it with us. So I think we're safer. We retooled, we reorganized. Our information databases are a lot more powerful, a lot better than they were in the years before 9/11. The analytical support that we got, I know a lot of my colleagues, the old schoolers that have now retired like you and I, didn't like a lot of that stuff because they thought that it was analysts telling agents what to do and all this other stuff. I said, no, don't look at it that way. These are assets. They're critical people, members of our team. I mean, they have the pleasure and luxury of taking all the information that guys and gals like you and I collect, Jerry, and looking at it while sitting behind a computer screen, because that's their job. Where as an agent, we've got so much that we're responsible for that we often don't have the luxury to sit back and look at the totality of all the information that we ourselves are even collecting, and do an analytical job on it. I don't know about you. I was not trained as an analyst. I mean, you learn it as an investigator by rote memory. I mean, you just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and during the course of your investigation, you get pretty good at it. But right out of the barn, you're not that good at it. Right out of the academy, you're not that good at it. So I mean, to have this extra analytical staff there, I thought was wonderful job that was done to get these young men and women on board and to help investigators, piece together the puzzle of the pieces that we're collecting for them. So from that perspective, I think we are safer. But I think where we let our guard down is we think that's history, and it's not history. What I submit to you is this: these people think in terms of centuries. We think in terms of days, weeks, months, and years. They think in terms of centuries. They look back to the Crusades, and they still laud their great Muslim warriors back in those days. And they talk about events that took place 2,000 years ago as it was like last week. And that is the darndest truth. And anybody that would argue with me on that, I would say, well, then you've never interviewed a real guy that was with Al-Qaeda or ISIS or one of these radical organizations, because this is the way they think. And to us Westerners that aren't familiar with that, they find that hard to believe. But it is the truth. My concern is that we're going to lose that cutting edge. And I think we need to not be chicken littles and say the sky's fallen, but we have to always remember that there are a lot of evil people out there that are plotting evil things. And that's not talkers, because they've actually pulled it off. And again, if they want to hurt us, like I said, less than $500,000, and look at the changes that they affected in the United States and the world. But just speaking from our point of view, the United States, everything in our lives that has changed as a result of that day for that low sum of money is a big return on their investment. And if they want to reach out again and touch us, they're more than capable of doing so.
Well, this has been fascinating.
Just I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So I do want to just do, a quick run through of your FBI career.
Sure.
But before we do that, you used the word haunted, and you talked about what ifs. And I know you're saying that right now that you've kind of come to terms with that, but I really am interested in how you got through those what ifs right after 9/11, on that day, and those days and weeks and months right after that, especially when you were testifying before the commission. I can't imagine. I mean, I thought about you. I didn't know, you then, but I can tell you as an agent, seeing you on TV and reading about you in the paper, I thought about you, and I wondered about your emotional, how you were getting through that emotionally.
I tell you, to be honest with you, it was not easy at all. It was very taxing on my family. I ultimately ended up divorcing my wife, put the poor girl through a lot of stuff. I mean, I was never home right after 9/11. I mean, I was starting to get a little physically ill with anxiety and stuff like that, because it was go, go, go. I mean, okay, this happened. In terms of the what ifing, that didn't really set in until like the dust had settled, so to speak, and we were in a routine. But initially in those days, and all the agents, including yourself, that were working for the Bureau on September 11th, 9/11, will always remember that, because it was all hands on deck, and it was game time. It was go time. I remember sleeping many nights at the office, just taking a nap for an hour and a half, 40 minutes or whatever, and then up and running again, and just doing what we had to do to keep the country safe. Everybody was doing it. Nobody was complaining about doing it. That's what's special about the men and women of the FBI. When it's game time, everybody's on their game, and you're very proud of it. But for my family, if I had one regret, I mean, I got divorced after 25 years, and I can say, been divorced now like 9 years. It did have a tremendous impact on my wife, and she's a wonderful woman, wonderful mother. And this job, me, based upon her response to my job responsibilities, kind of made it really rough on her, because I was not around a lot, because I was working all the time, traveling here, traveling there, going overseas here, going overseas there, all over the country doing our job. Left her with a lot of heavy lifting to do at home, raising kids and, taking care of house repairs, ordering, getting contractors and everything else in there. It's not funny, but it was like the weekend before September 11th. I think September 11th was a Tuesday, if I remember correctly. That weekend, I started remodeling one of our bathrooms. Right. I said, yeah, let's get this done. And I started knocking tiles off the walls and, just really enthusiastic about putting in a new bathroom. And obviously that I never got to finish that. So she had to hire a contractor. I had to hire a contractor. So that one bathroom went on to the whole house being remodeled. So it wasn't until after the dust settled, then I started what-ifing things. And it got very depressing, I'll be honest with you. I spoke to some friends about it, and I just said, what if this, what if that? Spoke to my priest about it, and and they just said, hey, it took me a time to come to grips with that. You don't have control over everything. Bad things happen when bad things want things to happen. You can't. We're not superhuman. I mean, you just can't prevent things from happening. Certain things have got to line up. Everything's got to be in place. I'm not an individual. I'm part of a broader team. I mean, we're part of the U.S. government. I mean, if it was meant to be prevented, I mean, there was any number of FBI agents, any number of CIA officers, any number of Defense Intelligence Agency people. We missed it, all right, collectively as a nation, not as an individual. And it took me a long time to come to grips with that, but I did, and I really do think, because of my faith, the good Lord helped me get through that. And I've come to grips with it. So it is what it is. But I say I'm haunted by it, because I do think that we were so close, in this United States, whether it be in Minneapolis or whether it be down here in Arizona. It used to anger me at times, and you'll get this mentality, Jerry. Sometimes the bigger offices in the FBI will have a tendency to ignore the little offices. At the time, before 9/11, we were a little office. Now I think we're like the fifth largest office in the United States, because we're like the fifth largest city. It's like, so when you're dealing with the mega offices like the New Yorks and the WFOs and stuff like that, they'll look at, what is this? What are these people in Phoenix talking about? They're a cow town. They're out in the middle of nowhere. But as I pointed out to you, these guys were conducting their hatred and they're spewing their vitriol out of a hunting lodge in rural Arizona, Cowboyville. So I think, if anything, what we were able to demonstrate was the whole country's got to be on alert to this stuff, because if it emanated from here, and like you said at the beginning of the interview, you had no idea about the presence of this Al-Qaeda type of stuff in Arizona, and I told you about some of the history, just touched on it briefly at the beginning of the interview, taking place in Tucson. It can happen anywhere in the United States. And I would submit to you that you'll find them more in probably rural areas now than you will in big cities. Why? Because big cities have the resources, i.e. more FBI agents, more police officers, more firefighters, everything to be on the lookout for that type of stuff.
What is your message to current agents who are working terrorism cases?
Well, my message to them would be, learn what you can about the nature of the target. Like right now, what I would be telling my agents right now would be, learn as much as you can about Iran. Learn as much as you can about the Shia religion. Learn as much as you can in terms of the 79 revolution in Iran, and get to know who these people are, because things are kind of testy right now between the United States government and the Iranian government. And the Iranian government, utilizing their proxies such as Hezbollah, could cause great harm and destruction in the United States. I mean, they have been operating in the United States for decades, since the revolution. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Hezbollah, the Al-Quds Force, are very worthy opponents, and they're lethal. The Bureau is not going to give you a little manual to teach you about Hezbollah, teach you about the Iranian Revolution, teach you about that. But go to Barnes & Noble, go to a bookstore, get online, read about this target, and start getting ready. I hope we never have to go to war with them, but start getting ready for that possibility. And really take it to heart. And just don't pay lip service to it. Don't wait for, what we used to say, Jerry, right? You had lead agents and you had case agents in the FBI. Yes. All right. And a lead agent is some agent that's going to sit around on their duff and wait for a supervisor to assign a lead to you to go out and cover that lead. A case agent is going to be the agent. He or she's going to get out there and is going to dig something up because it's their responsibility to dig it up and try to either put somebody in jail or prevent something from happening, or to recruit a good source of information. We cannot do this job by ourselves. We need people within our community, informants, confidential human sources, whatever the verbiage of the day is for them now, to do our job, to be our eyes and ears out there in different communities, whatever violation it is that you're working, to get us information that will keep America safe. So what I would say is, and I'm not saying they're not doing it, is take it seriously. One of the things, if you don't mind me giving my 2 cents on something, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I got to confirm it. But I had heard that there's some kind of class in Quantico right now where they're teaching people how to communicate with people, how to talk to other people. And I hope that's wrong. I'm going to cooperate this week. I'm going to meet with some colleagues that are still active duty guys and gals and say, hey, this is what I heard.
Well, you're going to have to let me know if you find out. Yeah.
Because what I'm saying is this, it's like, and I'm not saying that all the younger people are like this now, but what I've noticed, go to a restaurant or you go to a club or whatever, a sporting event or whatever, everybody's nose is buried in the cell phone. You don't see a lot of people like really engaging in conversation without that darn device in their face. Before I retired, I had, maybe 1 or 2 new agents that were like that. And I'd say, put that darn thing down. When we're sitting here talking to somebody, it's very rude for you to be looking at your cell phone. Pay attention to what that individual that we're speaking to is saying. Like I said earlier in the interview, the most important thing you could do as an agent is be a good listener. In the Oklahoma City bombing case, where that was critical, because we had to do very little talking. Myself and Agent Brad Petrie, I don't know if you ever talked to Brad Petrie. He's in Southern California now, but he retired out of Oregon. When we talked to Michael Fortier on the Oklahoma City bombing case, he was his own worst enemy, because you know what? He thought he was smarter than us, and we let him think he was. And we just let him talk, and we just listened, and we recorded everything, not figuratively recorded things with a tape recorder, but recorded it by notes and did excellent 302s on and let him hang himself. And he ultimately did hang himself. And then we were able to get information about the bombing conspiracy and everything else. But so many agents are just, they want to hear themselves talk. Just let other people do the talking. But to answer your original question, though, that you have to take the terrorist target seriously, no matter whether it be Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, or anything in between, a lone wolf, whatever, because there's only a few thousand of us across the country that work this stuff and around the globe. And and we're only as strong as our weakest link. If those men and women that are assigned counterterrorism want to really earn their paycheck and protect our country and live up to our oath of office, then you really got to take it seriously and don't pay it lip service. Don't go in there. It's not an 8-to-5 job. Never is an 8-to-5 job working counterterrorism stuff. A lot of these maggots get up and they're starting their night at like midnight. And that's when you're out with your informants, debriefing your informants after everybody else is dribbling on their pillow at night. If you got families, it's got to be a fine balancing act. Now, I'm preaching something I didn't practice.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of hard to do, even for those agents who aren't working terrorism. It is addicting, being an agent and working cases. And we all have to kind of keep in mind that there is a balance. All right, so thank you so much for speaking directly to the percentage of my audience who are current and former FBI.
I thank all my brothers and sisters and you too, man. We're all in this together and we all know what it's like.
All right. But before we go, just real quick, I want to spend, just a few minutes learning a little bit more about you, because people are always fascinated how my guest became agent. So I'm asking you the question, when did you become an agent and why did you become an agent?
Became an agent in '89, and I became an agent because my dad was a police officer in New Jersey, and I wanted to be a cop. In fact, I was weaned on the old FBI show. Remember that with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. And then I was weaned on Adam 12. I always wanted to be an LA cop. So when I got old enough, I moved to Southern California, and I tested for the San Diego Police Department and the LAPD, and I got hired by the LAPD first. But at the time, San Diego PD called me, and at that time, I was courting my wife. So I stayed with San Diego PD, and then when I had the opportunity to join the FBI, I took the FBI test, and I became an FBI agent. It was a lifelong dream, and I got to fulfill it. So I don't know how many people are blessed to be able to say that, but I'm blessed.
And you had mentioned that you retired a couple of years ago. What are you doing now?
I'm working with Keith Tolhurst, who gave you my name. We got Tolhurst International. We do private investigative work. We do training. We do active shooter training. We do all sorts of training. We train other agencies how to recruit informants and stuff like that. So I've been doing that now with Keith for about a year. And although it's not as exciting as being an FBI agent, it's fun hanging out with the guys and keeping the investigative skills honed. I also do some part-time work when they call me with the FBI. Like I just mentioned, the FBI asked me to go down to Malaysia in June of this year to speak at a counterterrorism symposium, and I'm going to go down there and do that. I'm also working as a private investigator for Crindler & Crindler in New York, who are suing the Saudi Arabian government on behalf of the victims, families, and survivors of September 11th. So that's my way of giving back for that. Anything I can do to help those victims out and their family members out, I'll do it. So just keep them a little busy.
Yeah, sounds like it. All right. So I like to give my guests the last word, and you have already given us so many wonderful words of wisdom. But is there anything left that you would like to say?
I think I've said it pretty much all, but I will say this. And I know it sounds corny, but I lived this my whole life as an FBI agent. Remember the day you first joined the FBI and the reason why you joined the FBI. I joined because I loved my country and I wanted to give something back to my country. From a counterterrorism perspective, I live and eat and breathe it even to this day. If you see something that's not right, give us a call. Let us be the arbiters on whether or not there's something there's something that's not there. If you see something and you don't report it, you'll have to live with that on your conscience for your whole life. And you go, maybe I could have done something to stop it. Give it to the professionals, whether it be your local law enforcement agency or the FBI. And we work jointly together, and we will give you some relief on your concerns. So you see something, say something.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Ken Williams. You'll find links to lots of articles about Ken and the Phoenix Memo. I included a link to the Office of Inspector General's special report where you'll be able to read, of course, redacted and unclassified copy of the Phoenix Memo. There's also an article about the Phoenix Mountain Arsonist case. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast, and subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. This podcast is about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, I want to invite you to join my reader team, where once a month, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI, books written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. Nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You can join on my website or use the link in the description of this episode in your podcast app. I would love it if you also check out my books. My nonfiction, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And there's also my Philadelphia FBI Corruption Squad crime series. All of my books are available wherever books are sold. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.